Hello, and welcome to this virtual lecture that deals with some of the most complicated aspects of the Maya script, the relationship between the visual and the textual, the placement of Maya hieroglyphs in a broader ancient Maya visual culture. But before we get there, I'd like to introduce a few glyphs of the day. Today's glyph is a syllable ya. It's a very, very common sign. It does have a fuller form, and that fuller form suggests that what ya actually represents is some kind of liquid coming from a mouth of a skeletal being, most likely an insect head, that looks very much like a blood-sucking insect of some kind. The earlier ya forms look more like scrolls of blood, and then later on, dots replace the central element. Ya can be combined with other common syllables in conflations, so you can only see half of the ya sign. The second very common syllable is yo. It is also a logogram, so you can read it as a syllable yo, but you can also read it as a logogram yop that means leaf, and it actually looks like a leaf. And then the third sign is no longer visually transparent, but some earlier forms suggest that it actually represents a kind of centipede. And in fact, there is a similar logogram that reads wak and apparently stands for a kind of centipede, and we see it in some place names, especially the name of the archaeological site of El Peru. So these are glyphs of the day. Returning somewhat to the previous topic, right? The basics of Maya script. You just have to remember that there are two kinds of signs. There are logograms, and then there are syllabic signs. Now, none of these two kinds of characters is completely devoid of sound. Both logograms and syllabic signs are phonetic. Logograms have only one pronunciation. They're not like ideograms. There are many ways to express the idea of a lord in Mayan languages, and there are in fact different words that mean lord or patron or master. In the language of Maya hieroglyphs, you can say ahau, you can say ahium, you can say ahtam, you can say ahtem, but the logogram ahau can be read only as ahau. So it is phonetic, but it combines pronunciation and meaning. The syllables, on the other hand, have nothing but pronunciation. They don't mean anything, even though they may look like something. The way we represent Maya writing, as you may remember, is through transcription, transliteration, and translation. So the three T's. The first one, transcription, shows the reading character by character. So in this particular example, we're looking at the spelling po, tun, ni. We show the logogram tun that also means stone, not just reads tun, in bold uppercase. And then we show the syllables, two syllables po, and the syllable ni in bold lowercase. And we also use brackets to indicate the parts of the second po syllable and then the whole ni syllable as something that we're actually not going to pronounce. The second o of po is silent, and then the ni is a phonetic complement, so it's also silent. Now in transliteration, we're going to indicate parts which are not in fact spelled at all, like that soft H in pop, a word for a reed mat. So the actual gloss is most likely pop. So we reconstruct that H, even though it is not spelled. And then translation would be stone mat or mat stone, depending on the context. In fact, there is a present-day town of Poptun in southern Patan. So Poptun is more likelier than Tun Pop, based on what we know from the available context. and the way we choose to translate or not translate at all, if we think it's like a place name, so it shouldn't be necessarily translated, really depends on us. So there are different levels of interpretation. First, you have to identify the characters, then you have to reconstruct actual words from the spellings, and then finally you decide to translate. And sometimes we may know how to read, we may understand how to pronounce words, but we may not necessarily be certain of translation. Sometimes it's even hard to read the text, not to mention transliterate or translate the text. So being aware and making sure that you represent the stages of your interpretation correctly is incredibly important in epigraphy. You also may remember that Maya writing uses blocks to spell hieroglyphs. And the blocks themselves do not necessarily indicate that one character is more important than others, grammatically speaking. If I want to spell the word "thought," I may choose to prioritize the initial syllable, the middle syllable, or the final syllable. The choice is more aesthetic, calligraphic than grammatical, even though quite often the larger character in a glyph block is going to be the root, or multiple roots if there's more than one main character inside a block, but it's not required. You also have to remember about conflations, the fact that characters are often combined, merged in my writing, and that's another major complication, trying to see those things, recognize them, and it requires some practice. There is really no other way about understanding those ways of combining, merging the characters together, which can be very playful and for that reason hard to figure out. Signs can also be superimposed. The most common form of superimposed character, of course, is the emblem glyph, a kind of royal title where the place name partially covers the lower part of the sign Hao, Lord, as in Kanula Hao, Kanu Lord. In the example that you see, the word pakap to kneel is conflated or superimposed in the lower example in the way that ka is partially covered by pa and bu is partially covered by tun. When you work with Maya characters, when you try to transcribe, transliterate, and translate a hieroglyphic inscription, you will most likely be working with the syllabary and the beginner's catalog. Now, in the syllabary, the characters are organized by letter. So characters which are similar are not going to be close to each other unless they're variants of the same syllable. And for example, you can see that B has three forms. One looks like 5 dots in a roughly cruciform pattern. The other looks like a serpent with the same dots in its forehead. And then the third example looks like a footprint that may have something to do with the fact that B stands for road, and roads are marked as lines with footprints in not just Mayan, but broader Mesoamerican iconographic tradition. So when you work with the syllabary, you just have to be aware of the fact that unless you know the pronunciation, the sign that you're looking for can be anywhere in the syllabary. So in this particular case, I am looking for the spelling of T, and as you can see, the syllables E and U are on one page of the syllable. The syllable T is on a different page, right? Because their spellings are different enough. The pronunciations of the syllables are different enough. Now, when I'm working with the beginner's catalog, this is different. There, the signs are organized by how similar they are to each other. And the lists start with rotatable characters, so the characters which can change their position, orientation in relation to the nearby larger character, the main sign. And what you see is a dotted circle that indicates the point of intersection, overlap, or connection between the rotatable character and the main sign. And then in this particular example, the word I'm looking for is couplets. So I will look for something scrolly from the rotatable characters, from the smaller affixes, prefixes, as they're called, uh, just signs that graphically look as if they're attached to a larger character. And then I will proceed to the main signs, and those are organized starting from simpler shapes, proceeding to the shapes which have irregular contour, and then moving on to body parts, human heads, heads of birds, amphibians, reptilians, and mammals, and then finishing with characters which contain two distinct elements. And there's actually a small subset of characters in my writing which contain three distinct elements. So sort of increased visual complexity. The sign I'm looking for is sort of halfway through. It does have an irregular contour and is grouped with similar characters which actually have a pretty regular, smooth, pebble-like shape. And in this way, you can distinguish between the sign wits from Cobb and Tulin or Ku, right? Especially Tulin and Ku and wits, they're all very, very similar. But wits will always have one or more scrolls, kind of curves, indicating this craggy, irregular shape because the sun actually represents a mountain. Now, moving on to today's topic, what we're going to discuss is how writing is connected to other forms of visual communication and representation. And then we'll look at the relationship between Maya glyphs and Maya images. So we'll consider the broader concept of visual culture. And then we'll look at something fairly unique to Mesoamerican writing systems. Mesoamerican writing systems do not have semantic characters, which are a common feature of the Old World writing systems. They are known under different names. They can be called determinatives, semantic characters, radicals, depending on which tradition of ancient writing systems of the Old World you were talking about. But the basic idea is that the semantic characters are used to qualify the meaning and sometimes reading of the nearby phonetic characters. That is not happening in Mesoamerican writing systems. On the other hand, Mesoamerican writing systems, including Maya hieroglyphs, use property qualifiers, distinct markers which qualify objects as pertaining to a certain class of things. And those markers occur in writing, but also in iconography, in representations of similar objects in ancient Maya art. And then finally, we'll look at the way Maya scribes used writing to express complex ideas about meaning and even ethnic or cultural identity. And we'll conclude today's class by considering some of the contexts of Maya writing and what those contexts potentially tell us about what Maya writing was actually meant to do, how it was meant to communicate and with whom. And of course, those revelations are very useful in trying to understand how we should judge, how we should evaluate what those inscriptions are telling, what their audience was probably like. So I borrowed this chart from a lengthy article by Simon Martin. I really like it, even though it's fairly complex. What you see is different modes of graphic communication, right? So when I want to represent something, when I want to tell a story using a graphic notation, I may choose to represent things iconically so that they look like something that I want to tell. On the other hand, I may rely on something conventionalized, still visual, but not necessarily reducible to language, to a sentence. The best example would be charts. That way of communication, that mode of communication is described as semasiographic communication. Things like charts are incredibly efficient, but they're not visually transparent. They require training in order to understand what is actually going on. And then finally, I may choose to represent things in a way that is not necessarily visually transparent, but allows me to convey actual words that I'm saying. So the recipient of my message will understand the words and interpret my message based on what the words are actually saying, rather what the graphic representation of those words looks like. So iconic or pictorial mode is fairly straightforward, but even there, there can be multiple conventions. So, for example, when we're looking at classic Maya images, scenes of courtly life, sometimes there'll be just a single scene, a single event depicted, for example, on the surface of a polychrome vessel. You see a rollout photo of a courtly scene, actually a tax payment scene or loan repayment scene, and all the protagonists are in the scene simultaneously. Another rollout photo right in the middle of the picture is actually a set of two events, so a two-step scene where the relationship between the two events is shown as a continuous picture. So first, we see an elderly god lying on a bed. His young wives surround him, and one of the young men in the scene is actually a maze god who's going to turn into a deer and try to kidnap one of the wives. And that's what we see in the second picture, where the young wife of the sick or dying hunting deity, wearing a hat, is escaping with a deer. So it's the scenes here actually cause and effect, but they're shown as a kind of continuous image. So unless we know and understand what is going on, we may interpret it as something that happens simultaneously, while in fact it doesn't. The representation is simultaneous, but the narrative is not. And then the last way of representing things may be illustrated by the famous murals of Bonampak. We have 3 rooms and we have 3 scenes. In fact, there is no clear indication in which order those scenes have to go. There is a battle scene, there is a dressing up and dancing scene, and there is another dressing scene in which the performers are wearing different costumes. Now, the second dancing scene has a captive dragged down the steps in the middle, and that perhaps refers to the aftermath of the battle scene. But that's just a hypothesis. It is quite possible that the order is not particularly relevant. What really matters is 3 scenes illustrating kinds of courtly life, things people do. In fact, the murals are dedicated to the young princes of the royal court of the archaeological site of Bonampak, where the building with the murals was located. So perhaps the goal of the author of the murals was to essentially illustrate 3 aspects of kingship: war, militarized dancing, and a slightly different kind of event with reception and a celebration and the presentation of tribute and even ambassadors from other kingdoms. So that is a cyclic mode of pictorial representation. The symasiographic mode, right, a conventionalized, a chart-like presentation requires specialized knowledge in order to understand what is going on. So what we see here, for example, is a chart from one of the Maya manuscripts that actually connects space and time. So what you see is footprints around a cruciform cosmogram, and then little circles, which are in fact 260-day glyphs, and then little dots are coefficients. So what the chart is actually doing, it tells you which side, which cardinal direction any given day in the 260-day cycle is potentially linked to. So this is a chart for a priest that enables the priest to position the offerings properly in accordance with the 260 divination calendar or divination cycle. So you have to be a priest, you have to be trained in calendar and Maya map traditions in order to understand what is going on in this map. Very much like present day maps and charts. And then the glottographic mode is obviously the writing itself, but it's very important that the glottographic mode, like writing only mode, is almost never alone in the case of Maya narratives. And in fact, in Mesoamerica in general, writing and visual presentation go hand in hand. In fact, Maya writing is more glottographic than most other traditions that we're aware of in Mesoamerica. We see more text in relation to image in the case of Maya monuments than, for example, in the case of Aztec monuments and pictorial books, right? They contain very little text and a lot of images. Maya inscriptions may contain more text than images, but even then, images are incredibly important. For example, here you see a story about a provincial ruler, a member of the court, an administrator, a keeper of the royal crown, and his gradual progression through various courtly appointments. So you would think that the seated figure in the center of that panel is him, but that's not the case. The image, in fact, shows the accession of his king in the presence of the king's mother and the king's father. It is the king who was the source of the official's advancements, successes, and he was the center of the official's universe. So the visual part and the textual part are actually telling slightly different stories, which are complementary. The text is a little vanity trip of the courtly official, naming his achievements, military and civilian successes and honors that he received through his lifetime. But the visual story centers that narrative firmly around or next to the body of the king, who is the source of everything in the protagonist's life, right? So ultimately, it is still the story about the king, even though it is not quite about the king. So Maya inscriptions are always characterized as relatively thin discourse, and that's something that Simon Martin also writes about, and in greater detail, of course, if you read his article. And that is a broader feature of Mesoamerican writing systems because they rely so much on visual communication. So when we look at Maya pictorial representations, in addition to text proper, we can also see text embedded in writing and in the visual representation. And so, for example, here you see a page from the Codex, and there the bees are descending, or the bee deity is descending upon an offering. As you can imagine, those manuscripts retrieved from northern Yucatan deal with things which were important for the population of the small towns where the priests using those manuscripts worked. And beekeeping, honey making were very important, very significant economic activities in that area. And as you can imagine, a lot of the priestly duties were about keeping the bees happy, supernaturally speaking. And so we have whole sets of bee-related rituals. So in this particular case, the kind of offering for the bees is labeled glyphically as 9 or many tamales, cornbreads, bolonte wach. In the scene to the right, the contents of a bundle presented by the ambassador to the king or a young member of the royal family is marked glyphically as 3 times 8,000, presumably 3 times 8,000 of cacao beans. So those are hieroglyphs. Sometimes the nature of an offering, instead of being depicted visually, may be represented as a glyph. In the image on the left, the deity of the god of death is receiving liquid incense, cha, as offering. And what you see is an actual hieroglyph, a syllable cha, inside an incense burner. In the image to the right, the king is dancing, and you can see that he's dancing near or upon or at the edge of a watery surface. So the visual connotations show us a stream or a foamy surface of water of some sort. But there are also hieroglyphs embedded in it, and they say that the scene in fact refers to Tik Knab, literally the edge of the ocean. So this is actually a beach scene or beach dancing or recreation of a beach dancing ritual, something that happens at the edge of the ocean, at the edge of the sea. Knab is sea or ocean in the language of the hieroglyphic inscriptions. So hieroglyphs and visual representations, they merge in my art. So when we look at this representation of watery surface, we see pictorial elements, water lilies, turtles, birds, crocodile, kind of swimming, appearing and disappearing in the semi-transparent surface. But it's interesting that this whole thing is also a hieroglyph that means Palau, ocean. And then the lower part of that image is also a hieroglyph that means Nab, a pool of water, or lake. So that connection between the visual and the glottographic is never entirely broken, never entirely cut in the case of the classic Maya writing and the classic Maya visual culture. Glyphs and images kind of blend together, and the contours, the outlooks of glyphs, they inform the visual language of complex icons in classic Maya imagery. So in this particular case, you're looking at a king who is depicted upon or inside a sacrificial bowl. So he is being offered as a sacrifice, or he emerges perhaps from the sacrifice reborn. His body looks like that of a baby, which is consistent with this notion of rebirth. The cruciform shape above him is the tree of life, marked with symbols of something shiny. This is a jewel, precious, shining tree. In fact, an image of that tree made of jade was placed upon the funeral sarcophagus with this scene. The king has a flaming axe in his forehead, suggesting that he is being transformed, or he becomes, or is becoming one of the ancestors, a wheel. He becomes one with this kind of energy or essence that ancestors have, and that gives legitimacy to his descendants. The tree is shiny, bright, but it's also an actual tree, so it's marked with te elements. And then the entire scene is placed within the maws of 2 centipedes. So you can kind of see their skeletal noses, the front nose, and then the jaws, mandibles. Those represent presumably the entrance to the underworld, or earth, or death in general. So the king emerges from the maws of death, facing the tree of life, the tree of his rebirth, as a wheel, as an ancestor. So glyphs and art here, they merge seamlessly, and knowing hieroglyphs essentially tells you what the image is striving to represent, right? So there's one-on-one correspondence between things like gesture and hieroglyph. So there is a hieroglyph for sadness, and every sad person, or most sad people in Maya art, would actually be shown in this particular facial, with this particular facial and bodily expression. So once again, there seems to be a direct correspondence between how you're supposed to show certain things in writing and in art. Or, for example, the hieroglyph Ichnal refers to someone's authoritative presence. So someone pointing to himself, indicating that this is the person in charge. So in this first scene, in the scene to the left, you see the king about to receive the crown from his subordinates. So it's a potentially ambiguous act because it is the subordinates who are giving the crown to the king. But the king is pointing to his chest, suggesting that he is in fact the authority, that it is in his Ichnal that the action is taking place. And then the image on the right is my favorite. It's actually a chest pendant, Yuh, according to the small inscription in the lower half. And it shows, presumably, the owner of the pendant pointing to the location of the pendant. So if you sit in front of the owner of this pendant, wearing a pendant, you will sit in his Ichnal, in his authoritative presence. And you will see the pendant, and you will see him depicted on the pendant, pointing to the fact that you are sitting in his authoritative presence. So this is a sign of authority, and the visual communication additionally clarifies it by placing the body of the owner in the form, in the likeness of a hieroglyph Ichnal. Hieroglyphs may also be used to highlight certain things, things that matter. So this is a scene of a household, but certain objects and people are additionally labeled. So when we look closer, we'll see that, for example, 3 beans of black beans are labeled as our beans, 3 of our beans. A basket is labeled as chach, and you wonder why these particular objects are labeled, but for example, not the mirror, not the lidded vessel in the scene, not the dark cone of either a plum-based ceramic vase or perhaps a cone of Highland salt from Salinas de Nuevos Cerros, or why there is no caption to the mantles of cloth. It is, for some reason, significant that the basket is chach, that there are 3 bags of black beans, perhaps because they are somehow involved in the transaction that is being depicted. So some things matter. Personal names, of course. In my art, people are wearing their names as elaborate hieroglyphs. The person in the scene is Kinichiash Kokmo, and you can actually see his name depicted semi-pictorially as the hieroglyphs for Kin, Sun, Yash, the jade bead, and then a hybrid Quetzal and Macaw bird. An additional aspect of my writing, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this class, is property qualifiers. So these are markers which place objects in writing, but also in representations into a broader class of things. So, for example, wooden things, treeish things are marked in Maya art and in writing. So a wooden house would be marked in iconography, but it would also be marked in writing as a logogram otot for dwelling. So here we see a wooden canoe, a person becoming a tree, and then a hunter shooting a celestial bird with a blowgun, and the bird is perched on a tree, and the tree is marked as a tree. Now, this canoe, for example, is still wooden, but the paddle used to pedal the canoe is actually made out of precious shell. It's a kind of special paddle that the gods of the twilight have, and it is marked as such, so that we know. Um, Stony things are marked with the sign for stone, but the category of stony things extends beyond uh, just what we would think is stone. For example, the gods supporting the sky, the Palachtuns, they're mountains, they're rocks, and so they're marked as stony. Buildings may be marked as wooden, but they may also be marked as stony, depending on what the scribe wants to say, how the scribe or the artist imagine buildings, whether they have wooden platforms, for example, or stone platforms. Parts of something whole are marked with this circle and a dot, and the early forms, in fact, look more like a bone sticking out of a cut body part. But the same marker may be applied, for example, to a branch of a tree. So the sign in the lower right corner, te, is part of a larger logogram te, and then part of something whole essentially shows you a cut of a tree branch. So that you know that this is not the whole tree. This is just part of a tree. But usually this marker occurs with body parts, right? So torsos, hands, feet, heads, arms. Shiny things are marked in my art, like glossy reflective surfaces. So a bloodletting tool, for example, that you see here, a celestial deity, the god of lightning, the flinty sun disk, or the moon disk, and bottle gourd. So what these objects have in common is that they have this reflective, glossy surface, right? And fish, of course. So you see the hieroglyph that represents a large, monstrous fish, shark, that is also shiny. Sometimes these markers change. You can confuse them occasionally if you don't know how early forms become later forms. So the late classic marker for tree-ish things looks sort of like early classic marker for shiny things. So the maize god in his cacao tree form in the sort of circular cartouche on the left, his body markers look sort of like tree body marks. And there are, in fact, ancestors shown as orchards in a later image on the sarcophagus of King Chanapakal of Palenque. But if we compare those early classic marks on the maize god's body with other instances of the so-called shiner, the marker of shiny reflective surfaces, we'll see that they are consistent with reflective, shiny nature of the maize god and not with the tree-ish nature of the maize god, even though he obviously has cacao pods growing out of his body. Precious shell-like things may be marked with kan, and some of those things are obvious. Yellowish limestone, ripe corn cob, yellow flintstone, yellow pocket gopher. But then you also get blood, the sacred royal blood, marked as something that is yash and kan. And that has nothing to do with color. That is about the precious nature of that blood. That it contains everything that is yash, green, blue, and kan, yellow. So this is more like poetry expressed visually. The singing and breathing things are marked with a sign for wind, and it's interesting that music and sound are connected to breathing, and the god of wind is also the god of music. So things like rattles, but then also pendants, like belt pendants, are marked as musical instruments. And we know that that was indeed the case, and this sharp metallic sound of those belt pendants was essentially part of their design. But it's interesting that in my art we can actually see which objects can speak, make sound based on the way they're marked with these wind-like characters. And then of course some objects are marked because they breathe, because they exhale, or because they smell. In fact, there is a separate marker for really smelly, like musky things, and we see it on animals like wild boars, but also on hunters, because they do have to cover themselves in musk to hide their own body smell. So there is a marker that indicates kinds of things that you cannot see, you cannot experience when you look at on an image, but the markers essentially help you out in classifying which things in what you see are actually smelly, musky. Dark and nocturnal creatures are also marked with the sign for darkness, Kab. And it's interesting that it extends to creatures which are mostly nocturnal, but also creatures which spend most of the time underground. So certain insects, for example. So most of the rodents are obviously nocturnal. Fireflies, as in the image that you see in the lower left corner. Bats, jaguars, they're all marked with this property qualifier. And then some objects are marked as especially black, dark. So obsidian, for example, is not necessarily nocturnal, but it is black. It is dark. And so obsidian blades may be recognized in writing, where it's just a syllable or a logogram ta or ta, obsidian, but also in iconography as something marked with this darkness symbol in the same way nocturnal animals or underground animals are marked. In the scene, it's interesting that we see individuals who are obsidian officials, so their official title is obsidians. These are in fact Maya scholars, specialists in astrology or in calendar, in astronomical calculations. And just like scholars of today, they have ranks. You start out as a stepping up youth, Teket, Chok. You proceed to junior obsidian, it's in Tach, and then the highest position is Sakuntach, and then you report to the king as the wind god with obsidian. So the king is still the patron of all arts and sciences, but in distinct supernatural manifestations. So the obsidians themselves are black, right? They paint their bodies black. At least the senior obsidians do. So their bodily paint reflects the nature of obsidian, even though they themselves are obsidians probably metaphorically because they have special knowledge, priestly knowledge, that sets them apart from everybody else. Everything is alive in my art, or at least many things are. We call this form of religious belief animism. And so we see a lot of animation in my art. So things which, from our point of view, do not have agency, do not have volition in my art, have extremities, eyes, noses, mouths. So you see on the left a flint blade with a mouth, a living knife of flintstone. And to the right, of course, you see a tree. And trees in my art are upside down, right? Their heads are partially buried in the ground because they drink and eat earth and water from the ground, the roots of their arms and the branches of their legs. And their ears are like jaguar claws because, of course, you're in the tropics and many trees have a very sharp, very nasty thorns, not unlike jaguar claws. Numbers have animated, personified versions. So certain gods are patrons of numbers, as we have discussed. Um, Waters. Uh, when we look at my representations of water, all the examples that you see are just a hieroglyph, hot water. But some of my scribes take it several notches up and actually show you what they think of water. So you see this water serpent, an enormous water serpent, um, swirling around, or in this case, raining, and there's an image of a rat and a deer. Sometimes they're shown pouring water from jars, so something about the mythology or the sort of mystical nature of rain. And then in the lowest image, you see a large watery dragon, like a crocodile, with a tail that looks like a stream of water, and with a sun god in its belly, swimming around the place name for the city. And the city itself is Pachan, and the full name of the city is Tanha Pachan. Pachan surrounded by water, so Pachan in the midst of waters. And the city is on steep hills on a peninsula, so surrounded by water on all three sides. So the scribe literally made the characters interact with each other so that they evoke the nature of the city, this massive stream of water, the river flowing around the city as a living, breathing, hungry being, right? Consuming the sun, presumably the sun of the night, going through the underworld before rising again in the east. Most of my images can be analyzed that way, right? If you know my hieroglyphs, if you know what they stand for, this is the birth of maize, and you see water and rain in the lower level. You see the carapace of the turtle, the birth from the seed, from the burning seed or sprouting seed, and the shape of the crack in the turtle, and the shape and the pose and the expression of the maize god in the center are consistent with the hieroglyph for birth. So you know, if you know my writing, if you understand what is going on, then you can literally interpret the scenes in terms of discrete blocks of meaning, right? Everything is very specific, closely linked to writing. So writing and visual culture, they never stop talking to each other in case of Maya visual narratives and written narratives. Sometimes Maya hieroglyphs extend visual metaphors to the level of metaphysics. So these are variants of the hieroglyph tzak, that literally means to put things together, to add things up. And it's a highly important concept that refers to time, order, and royal succession. And so Maya scribes continue innovating new varieties of that character, which usually show two things which together form something whole. So two complementary pairs, not necessarily the opposites, but things which require each other. So you see the sun and the moon, the sky and the earth, the wind and the water, the bread and the water, the sun and the moon, the green, blue things and the yellow things. And this is actually a kind of literary couplet, a difrasismo, or a diphrastic canon that we see in the text as well. And we know from early colonial texts that it means glorious. So when someone or something is green, blue, and yellow, it is actually glorious. That's how you're supposed to translate it. That's what it actually means. And then we see clouds and water and leaves and bread, leaves and tamales. Of course, you need leaves to wrap the tamales so that you could actually cook it. Those two things, they have to go together. And then star and moon, darkness and light, women and men, day and night, bloodletting tools and blood, and my favorite perhaps uh, claw and tooth, or paw and tooth. Like you would say, I fought tooth and nail. That's what it is. Maya scribes apparently thought of those as a kind of complementary there too. So when we look at Maya writing, we see these visual metaphors extending to, for example, how the signs are organized. For example, when Maya scribes describe eating or ingestion of different kinds, you can see how the characters are grouped in accordance with how Maya classify ingestion, right? What is considered to be uh, things which can happen to your mouth, right? Whether it's something coming in or something coming out. And then, for example, cave signs, they actually show us what Maya thinks of caves. They're variants, they're allogryphs of the 10K logogram, which show bones, and that's the majority of the characters, indicating that caves are places where the dead reside, where you bury or cache the remains of your ancestors. Then there are also variants which exemplify the notion of darkness or the edge of light and dark. So sun partially covered by darkness, or lack of the senses, sensory deprivation. So you see an eye in the dark, right? So this is what caveness is like to a Maya scribe. And this is a slightly more elaborate version of the same idea. In this case, a whole mountain with a cave opening. You can see that it's marked with skulls and bones, but also jade beads and perhaps a sprouting maze in the center. But then from the open mouth, you can see an ancestor emerging. So spirits of the ancestors emerging from the cave, from the place of the dead. Writing may also indicate identity, like cultural identity of the scribes. This is less common, but there is a period of time in the early classic inscriptions when some scribes highlight their knowledge or connection to certain cultural realities associated with central Mexico, the great city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico. So the image on the left shows a kind of royal title that apparently spells a partially foreign word, perhaps in an ancestral form of Nahuatl, Coscapetlatl, the jeweled throne. In the image on the right, a foreign god is mentioned, whose name is Washaklahunubachkan, 18 heads of serpent, or 18 images of serpent. Now, the name of the god is spelled using Mayan words, so it's a kind of translation most likely. But curiously, in the second instance of the same name in one text on the so-called Tikal marker, which recreates the shape of the central Mexican Teotihuacan banner, perhaps military banner. So on the shaft of that banner stone, you have an inscription, and in reference to that deity, the scribe uses a typical Maya logogram for a snake, and that's the one above, and then next time the same name occurs, we see a fire-breathing plates covered, some kind of mosaic covered fire serpent of central Mexico. And it's interesting that it is still supposed to be read as kun because there's actually a phonetic complement right below it. But the scribe wants to give us a hint that this is not an ordinary snake. This snake is not quite like other snakes, right? This is a Mexican snake. So it's a kind of code switching, which is completely visual, right? It doesn't affect the reading of the text, but the reader becomes aware that we're crossing into a culturally distinct or culturally different alien territory with the names of these gods, which are non-local. And then the last point I wanted to discuss is sort of the politics or the function of text. So what you see, for example, is the largest hieroglyphic inscriptions. In fact, one of the spatially largest inscription in the ancient world, the hieroglyphic stairway of Copan, and then a small pottery vessel from around uh, Dos Pilas uh, in Petén Batún, central Petén, Guatemala. Now, it may seem like the stairway is a much more public monument, uh, accessible to a larger audience. But the truth is, the text is so big and the stairway is so tall, there is no way to read it comfortably unless you have a spyglass or a drone, or you gradually crawl along the steps trying to read them one by one. And trust me, I know I spent 3 years of my life trying to 3D scan this stairway. So it's a monument that everyone can see, but it's very hard to read because of its size and distance and the angle of view, right? If you want us to see upper steps, you will be probably too far unless you stand right on them. And if you're at the bottom of the stairway, you can see the last few lines of the text, but not the rest of it. To make the matters worse, there are actually two parts of the text, and it starts from the middle and it goes to the bottom, and then it continues from the top down to the middle. So you would ask, why would somebody carve a text like this? But that's not a very straightforward answer. There's no straightforward answer to this question. In the same way, we would ask, why the great Behistuni rock, commissioned by the great Darius of Persia to commemorate his triumph and accession, and reuniting the country, victories over rebellious princes, why would he carve it on a rock that no one can actually read, and making sure that access to the rock is partially removed so that no one could deface the inscriptions, and by default no one could actually read most of them. So that enormous text and the hieroglyphic stairway are in fact similar. They are the messages to the world at large, to the world of humans and gods, highly visible in general, and not particularly accessible specifically. So this is something about how and why these inscriptions are carved, who the audience is. Of course, if you're a god, it doesn't really matter. You can still read it. They can fly. They can see things. So a lot of my inscriptions are in this rather unusual category of messages to the great beyond, or messages to a select few. Or consider this panel. It is incredibly visible. It's right in the center of a stairway on a platform above it. People can see it from afar. The hieroglyphs are small. They're about this big. So you cannot read it, right? So this text is visible, just like the hieroglyphic stairway, but for a slightly different reason, not particularly accessible. This monument is in fact a name stone. Its purpose is to name the dead, but apparently not everyone is allowed to do so. Not everyone's attention is desired or expected, right? So only a select few, the right people, the important people, or perhaps ancestors and gods as well, are expected to actually use the name stone, activate the name stone with their words. Some inscriptions, which for example name the king and apparently represent the king's speech at the archaeological site of Copan, the same site that has the hieroglyphic stairway, are located deep within the sanctuaries of the temples or the palaces. And once again, you would think that the royal speech would have some kind of public presence. But that's if we assume that the audience of the king's speech are the commoners or other nobles. But it appears that a lot of what the king does is directed at his ancestors and gods. And those communications are private, exclusive, special, and in some cases, the king may choose to perpetuate this conversation by carving it down, make those words eternal, have those prayers forever uttered, ever and ever and ever inside those sacred spaces. But these are not things for larger audiences. So kind of wonder what it means in terms of, for example, propaganda and lies and false information. What's the point of lying when you're talking to a god or an ancestor? On the other hand, when we read those inscriptions, are we getting a glimpse of what most Maya people believed in, like sort of the core, the fundamentals of ancient Maya worldview and religion, or are we getting just a glimpse of what the top 1/10% of the classic Maya population actually believed in, the way they saw the world, perhaps sincerely so, but still in a way that was quite different from everybody else? And there are no good answers to these questions. What is also important is that texts are profoundly material when it comes to the Maya. Right? They are carved on something, and that something is often named. It has its own soul, um, and it can be moved around. Right? We already mentioned the fact that we don't really see propaganda as such in the case of the classic Maya, perhaps because the context of the inscriptions, the communication with the gods and ancestors, is not really the right context for propaganda. We do see omissions, strategic omissions. We see spins trying to present things in a favorable light in the same way as you would when you talk to a powerful supernatural being, whether it's your ancestor or your patron deity. But no outright lies. What we also see is that text can be manipulated, very much like human bodies can be manipulated. So we see texts who are captured. We see texts that are mutilated. We see texts like parts of the hieroglyphic stair of Karakol, which are then brought by the victorious city of Naranjo to Naranjo's own main plaza and then kept there as trophy. And the nice detail of the story is that this captured narrative in fact describes an earlier defeat of Naranjo by Caracol. So you have a ruler of one city sacking his enemy and taking the story of a previous reversal of fortunes back to his home city and keeping it there as a trophy. And it's interesting that while nobody bothered to reassemble the story in its original format, so nobody was scared about how continuous that narrative was, they didn't care about what the inscriptions actually said either. They didn't deface the part where the defeat of Naranjo was described and the capture and death of Naranjo's kings was referred to. So they didn't try to question or to erase those words from the inscriptions. Everybody walking by could see those words and perhaps read them if they could read and write. But they would also remember that these blocks were in fact brought from the city of their arch enemies who were responsible for that early defeat. And ultimately, Naranjo had the upper hand. Naranjo had the lost love in that story. And that perhaps was more important than the original narrative. Right? So these complex relationships between the text and the medium, like the monuments themselves, was very important to the Maya. And we also have to consider it as we try to understand what the inscriptions are actually about. Now, most texts that we have are dedicatory inscriptions, which obviously makes sense. They are on something, on monuments, on buildings, on personal possessions. So in terms of the genre, you would probably be right if you say that 90% of all my inscriptions are just dedication statements. But that would not be entirely correct. For example, this is a piece of an ancient Maya monument, Stilabi from Copan, and it is a monument celebrating the passage of time, rituals undertaken by the king to sustain the time. So most of the text describes some of these rituals, the dedication of the monument, the name of the monument, what the monument actually represents. because the essence of the monument and the representation upon the monument are in fact different things, and then what the king did and which deity the king himself was merged with during the rituals. So it is still mostly a dedicatory text. The hieroglyphic stairway of Copan is also a dedicatory text. The last sentence of the narrative makes sure of that, telling us that the stairway of the tomb of the king of Copan was dedicated. And indeed, there is a burial of the 12th king of the dynasty, the greatest of all Copan kings, right underneath the central axis of the temple where the stairway is located. On the other hand, a large portion of the narrative of the hieroglyphic stairway has nothing to do with dedication. It's the story of the royal dynasty. And in fact, the second half of the narrative is the story of a traumatic episode in which the 13th king of the dynasty was captured and then executed by his distant relative and former vassal at the archaeological site of Quirigua. So all of those things technically are still connected to the dedication of the stairway. But there is way more context, there is way more rhetoric and ritual references there. A step at the nearby Temple 11 at Copan technically is just the same kind of narrative, just the dedication, in this case, of a temple where the step was located. But it also makes sure that it carries a message about the continuity of the dynasty, saying that the temple belongs to all of the previous kings, and then it lists those previous kings, providing us with the first accepted lists of the kings, in which presumably some kings may not have actually been included. So that seems to be the real message, the real function of the inscription, as opposed to its formal genre, which is always the dedication, in this case of a building where the step was located. When we look at Copan, and this is just a broad view of the valley, right? It is also interesting to consider the placement and the significance of some monuments, and once again, in terms of understanding how they're actually supposed to communicate, what their function is like. So this is the valley of Copan. The city is more or less here. There is a road going east that way into mostly non-Mayan lands. And there's a road going west towards Guatemala, towards the Maya heartland. So if you take the eastern road, or if you arrive from the east to Copan, you're arriving here to the eastern edge of the Great Plaza. This is north, this is west, this is east, this is north, this is west. In fact, visitors would pass through the customs. There was a so-called roadhouse with some kind of official in charge of that, and we know it because he had an inscribed throne mentioning him and the nature of the building. And then you would be about to enter the main plaza, and the first monument that you'll see would be Stela J. And Stela J is a very unusual monument. It's a metastela. And when I'm saying it's a metastela, it's a stela that tells you something about the cult of stone monuments. The carving itself shows the monument as a living being. It has eyes, a nose, and mouth, and it is wrapped in cloth. And this is something we know from the hieroglyphic inscriptions is part of the dedication ritual. The monument is kahlach, literally bound. And we see that act in various scenes. For example, on a pottery vessel here, you see a monument still wrapped in cloth with a big bundle, and someone is being sacrificed on an altar in front of it. And in fact, Stela J has its own stone bundle that would at some point be on the very top of the monument. Now it's sitting by its side. So a monument, in fact, shows itself in the act of being dedicated. So it's a very unusual monument. But the text on it is even more unusual. The front of the monument that faces the plaza, the inner side of Copan, tells you how this cult of stone monuments came to be hundreds of thousands of years ago, as gods decided to do it. The back of the monument that faces the visitors tells you how the first monument was dedicated by the first king of Copan, and then by the 13th ruler who dedicated the monument. And then the sides of the stela tell you what you're supposed to do on every year of the 20-year cycle that is being celebrated by these monuments. So the monument is prescriptive in its nature. Presumably, the goal is to inform you that you're entering the Maya space. You're crossing some kind of cultural, civilizational boundary. You're entering Maya space-time, where monuments and rituals associated with them are important. It is curious that this is everything, told in hieroglyphic inscriptions. Obviously, nobody assumes that the visitors can read and write if they come from the East, if they're not Maya. But no one cares, at least you were told, right? Or your gods and ancestors, your animistic entities and centers that come with you have been warned, right? You enter a different place, and that's how it is marked. So the monument is sending this very powerful message about identity that targets visitors and perhaps part of the population. We in fact know that the population of the Copan kingdom and the city of Copan specifically was almost 40% recent immigrants. And perhaps this anxiety about cultural identity is what creates monuments like stelae in the first place. Their prescriptive nature is part of the insecurity felt by the ruling elites of Copan in terms of who they were, which language they spoke, which gods they worshipped, what kind of time, what kind of ritual cycle they actually lived in. Finally, there's another very interesting aspect about my monuments at Copan. So this is the hieroglyphic stairway, and this is another major structure, Temple 16 of Copan, dedicated to the founder of the dynasty, the earliest king. In fact, his burial is deep within. On the many layers of construction activities, there is his original palace, and his tomb is under that palace. And he used to be there until he was excavated by archaeologists using archaeological tunnels to get all the way into the heart of the ancient city, its earliest construction phases. So right in front of that funeral temple in its latest version is an altar. We call it altar Q. And this is the story of the foundation of the kingdom. And it also mentions offerings made by the 16th king of the dynasty to the founder. Now, the way the monument is placed on tall supports means that you cannot actually see the inscription unless you stand on the stairway of the temple. Not just that, the hieroglyphs themselves are turned in a way that they can only be seen and read from the stairway. But if you look at the stairway and you stand in front of the altar looking towards the stairway, that's what you see. You see a tall platform showing skulls and the butterfly-nosed Teotihuacan deity of war and fire, presumably, or lightning. And then further above is a sun disk. Yes, that big square thing is actually a sun disk with centipede rays of light in its corners. And there is a figure of the ruler as the sun looking at the altar. So the creators of the temple and the altar literally imagined a space in which the spirit of the ancestor, embodied and souled, would have an opportunity to read a message, like a letter from the descendants, saying that they still remember, that they make offerings, that he is still their king. So the monument creates this discursive space. And it's interesting that the hieroglyphs are part of that space and they're not directed at the living. They are directed at the supernatural participants who are also physically present as idols in this special space recreated by means of architecture.